Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Hill, CEO of New Hydrogen, and I'm here to talk a little bit about today why California has more hydrogen fuel cell vehicles than anyone else in the world except for maybe South Korea, about 20,000 electric vehicles on the road. And to help answer some of these questions, my guest today is Dr. Alan Lloyd. He's the former secretary for the California EPA, and he has many other credentials. In fact, we could fill up this entire podcast just talking about Dr. Lloyd's experience and his credentials. But today I want to ask him a little bit more about this California, why there are so many vehicles on the road. He had a hand in that. And so and I should say, Dr. Lloyd has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. I'm so glad to have you on board. And so welcome, Alan. We're so pleased and fortunate to have you. And first, maybe you could give us some background on this, given that you've been very instrumental in helping this happen.
Yeah, I think the key question, Steve, there is California, in fact, has led the way with fuel cell cars. And you can trace that back to the early 90s when it passed a requirement that the car companies had to offer for sale a certain number of zero emission vehicles, zero tailpipe. At that time, there was focus on public health. It wasn't to do with greenhouse gases. But the communities in Los Angeles were significantly being impacted by emission from cars and trucks. So modeling studies told the California Air Resources Board that in order to maintain or attain the air quality health standards, you would have essentially have to reduce emission from tailpipe to essentially zero. And so they gained confidence, as regulators gained confidence that they could pass a requirement for zero emission vehicles, having seen the EV1, or the precursor to that, which was developed by General Motors in conjunction with their environment. And these were battery-powered zero-emission vehicles.
Mm-hmm. So what was you mentioned General Motors, but what was the general reaction from the automotive companies when this mandate came out?
Well, as is predicted, of course, they were astounded that these regulators, once they saw this technology at an auto show, would then translate that into a regulation requiring them to produce zero-emission vehicles. And so it became a very contentious many years on that, because initially you had to offer, I think it was 10% of the new sales vehicles, or 5% new sales vehicles offered in 1998 be zero emission. Over the years, that got diluted many times because, in fact, they weren't producing these vehicles, and the batteries which we can put in these electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, weren't able to perform in terms of cost, in terms of range, or in terms of the performance that people would require. So the regulation then was trying to be adjusted to make sure that when the technology got on the road, people would buy these vehicles.
So the zero emission mandate allowed auto companies to meet the requirement with both battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, or was it too early for that? What was the
when this created, fuel cell vehicles weren't on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
It was only in the late 90s that a lot of the work on the fuel cell vehicles came into prominence. Mm-hmm. And Ballard first came out and demonstrated with their new PEM technology, polymer electrolyte membrane technology, that you could put this in a bus. And they demonstrated that in Los Angeles, operating around the airport. Daimler-Benz, Mercedes did a lot of work as well as Ford, working on fuel cell vehicles. So they began to be in a demonstration phase. And so when, in fact, the regulation came up for review at the end in the early 2000s, you then had two technologies that could meet the requirements of zero-emission vehicles. You had the batteries, and you also had the fuel cell vehicles. Of course, fuel cell, which was very limited in experience, very costly at that stage, whereas batteries had been around for a long time. But that was the idea, that people said, well, you're regulating and there's just one technology. Well, any technology that can meet zero emissions could meet the requirement. And fuel cells were there at that time.
So they were able to choose one or the other, or both.
They were able to choose both, except, of course, that not all companies were making fuel cells, but Toyota and Honda were in that as well. But they were very expensive. So there had to be adjustments made in terms of what the incentives were in the regulations, so that people could look at the fuel cell and require to produce less of those than the battery vehicles. But of course, then as that came about and that was implemented, the whole thing was revolutionized by the introduction of the lithium-ion battery, which really gave a tremendous boost then to the battery electric vehicle. And of course, a lot of the rest is history there. But the fuel cell has still gone ahead at a slower pace, but now is also picked up. So you do have these vehicles on the road. And as you say, tracing directly back to California's ZEV mandate, that's where California has actually supported the fuel cells as well as the batteries to get those on the road.
Yeah, it would be hard to believe that we would be at this stage, even with the fuel cell vehicles, had that not taken place. Would you agree with that?
I agree completely. That this is a forcing function, that you have that vision, you have that target. But as in a lot of things, you have to modify this as new information becomes available, and you adjust to how the public is reacting to that. Now, one critical thing, Steve, that was formed in the late 90s, 1999 actually, was the California Fuel Cell Partnership. And this was created to solve the so-called chicken and egg approach. And that is, okay, if you got, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you have you got your cars, how are you going to refuel them? Mm-hmm. So should you put a refueling network out there first, wait for the cars, or vice versa? California Fuel Cell Partnership, which was a partnership of the regulators and, for example, the Energy Commission in California, together with the car companies, particularly, and that time it was Ford and Daimler, as well as the energy companies, particularly Shell, to come together to say, okay, we'll time this in a way that says, once your cars are there, we'll have the fueling. Well, as that developed over a period of time, the energy companies, not unexpectedly and maybe realistically, said, we're not going to put stations out there, and there's going to be no revenue for many, many years. And the car company said, well, I thought you promised that. So how do you solve this chicken and egg approach? In the end, again, California, what they did, the government stepped up and the legislature and put money in there, I think $100 million to start with, to fund some of these stations, so that in fact the car companies then would have some refueling. And you even had Toyota putting money in when they didn't have enough money from the state to do that. So it's a very interesting thing, but that's where, if in fact the state of California had not put in that money, then we wouldn't have as many cars today. And in fact, you can contrast that with Texas, which had limited capability and very high interest in hydrogen in the early 2000s, but the legislature didn't put any money with the legislation to encourage the production and deployment of hydrogen.
You mentioned some interesting things. It is sort of a dilemma. Where do we get started? Who's going to pay for this? We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in building an infrastructure that can support these vehicles. And today, we do see a lot of electric vehicle charging stations popping up with Tesla, and now forming partnerships and others, Electrify America and some others, that are sort of building out their networks so that users can have somewhere to charge. it's still a challenge, but there's certainly a greater network than hydrogen. Have automakers gone the direction of electric and not hydrogen, or and that's why we see so much recharging stations, or is hydrogen still coming along? I know there are some hydrogen refueling stations, and what's happening?
Well, I think it's a very good point, Steve. But one thing you have to realize, that hydrogen without a refueling station, you're not going to sell any cars. With the battery electric, you can always charge them at home. Mm. And that's a huge advantage because you've got the infrastructure of your electricity supply at home in order to be able to do that. And then, of course, that's been built on by charging at work, at public places and stores, etc. So I think that's one reason, together with the emergence of the lithium-ion battery and the performance and cost coming down over the years, that has seen this dramatic rise in battery electric vehicles. Fuel cell electric vehicles are coming along, but at a much slower pace, probably a decade behind the battery electrics. And in some cases, they will never basically replace the battery electric vehicles. But if you're looking for additional range for the cars where you can refuel in a very short time, then the fuel cell becomes very attractive. And that's even more so when you look at trucks. Or, of course, when you think of it, all the fuel cell vehicles are in fact hybrids because they also have a small battery. So I think we're looking at the battery electric. The good news is it's a zero emission technology, which has really been tremendous in terms of the global expansion along the way. Fuel cells are coming, but at a slower rate.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some companies like Toyota have not waited for full government support and gone ahead and invested some. I know Toyota has never actually, and I think there are some other companies as well that have never actually given up on this hydrogen strategy, this fuel cell strategy. They're moving into electric, I think, but they're large enough companies where they can afford to kind of branch out and work on both. But I'm kind of seeing this behind the scenes. I don't think these large automakers, particularly Toyota, are giving up on the hydrogen fuel cell strategy.
I think that's definitely the case, because if you look at the longer term view and you look at the holistic view of where the strengths of hydrogen are and fuel cells compared to batteries, then in fact the rapid recharging it can be very important, and the greater range can be important. And then complement that, of course, with the shorter range for the batteries. And then when you look at the trucks, that's where people have also been working and realizing that, again, you've got the battery electric trucks, which are very good for locals. But when you look at the long haul and quick recharging, then in fact you've got the complement with the fuel cell. Because I think the more you look at some of this and the applications, then you realize you're going to need both the batteries and the fuel cell. Or I would also add that I've become aware over the last year or so, the significant amount of work going on in hydrogen internal combustion engines. Now, that's not emission free, so you have to control the NOx. But in certain applications, it may have the benefit that the engine is going to be less expensive, and the purity of hydrogen is not going to be as great. But again, that's not going to fly in California and it doesn't comply with the zero emission mandate.
You know, you mentioned something a little earlier that I thought was really interesting. You're talking about infrastructure and how battery electric vehicles have an edge because you can charge at home. And it made me think, right now, I know we're working on hydrogen hubs. We're working on transportation of hydrogen to and fro. And we actually have natural gas in our homes in the United States, many of us, and throughout the world in many locations. Is it a possibility that that hydrogen could be piped through those lines at some point along the way, and then we would have that kind of localized uh, ability to refuel at home with hydrogen, or is that just not a reality?
Well, I think in theory it is the case, but I think that as I recollect several years ago now, probably a decade ago, Honda, who was selling a natural gas vehicles, they tried that, I think, with a company there who would put a refueling station at home. It was never really commercial success. So I think it's going to be with hydrogen, with the issues associated when the cost there, I think it's going to be more difficult to have that distribution in various houses there, because you're adding an infrastructure, whereas electricity, you already had that infrastructure.
So it's a little further down the line, and the main and what I hear you saying is the main opportunities really lie in the trucking industry to start with, because it makes sense for long haul, to be able to have that energy density of hydrogen to be able to go those long ranges, and quick recharging, which also is important for trucking.
And also, of course, in decarbonizing industrial processes, for example, steel. In fact, the same thing for petroleum production, ammonia, and also methanol. So you have a whole category out there that in the industrial side, and the power generation, which can use hydrogen.
Yeah, and you mentioned ammonia. When you think about how that's a hydrogen-based product that can be then converted into or made fertilizer made from, then you're talking about a potential, if we can find a way to leverage the hydrogen to feed the world using a renewable source that has zero carbon output as well, which is another fascinating, huge industry.
Correct, and some of the shipping companies are looking at as ammonia as a power source to drive there, as well as looking at methanol. So getting renewable hydrogen into those arenas become very beneficial.
So circling back to the zero emission mandate, where do we stand today with that?
Well, that's been now emerged basically into the advanced clean vehicle program that ARB has created. So it's still there on the umbrella of trying to advance the technology across the board. And EPA has adopted that too, and similar with the advanced clean truck rule. And of course, as you know, California's got very aggressive goals in terms of trying to phase out internal combustion engines. Now, whether the time frame of that is unrealistic, time will tell. Same with the ZEV mandate, that was diluted over a period of time. But having that goal there was extremely important in terms of giving some certainty to the industry that this is what's going to be required. Now, then the question comes into it, whether in fact the technology is available at the right cost and the right performance. And that's obviously a lot of the balance there.
A hugely important factor in seeing this move forward. We have to make sure that price gets down to where it's a reasonable cost to be able to compete with fossil fuels. One final question for you, Alan, and this is kind of off topic a little bit, but a lot of people may have heard your name somewhere along the way, and you've talked about electric vehicles. I hope you don't mind my asking. There was a video that came out a long time ago about, I think it was called "Who Killed the Electric Car," and if I'm not mistaken, you were the villain in that story. Can you enlighten us a little bit?
I was one of the, I think, 5 villains on that. Correct. Yes, the background to that was that I was accused basically of showing favoritism to fuel cell vehicles, because at that time I was chairman in my role, chairman of the California Fuel Cell Partnership, as well as my role of chairman of CARB. But obviously, I failed completely if you look at the success of the battery electric vehicles today. I will take that failure saying, but on the serious side, what I was trying to make sure that in fact a new technology which could meet the goals of the zero emission vehicles, the people had a choice. But on the other hand, I could also see why people thought there was a conflict. Those people who knew me or know what was involved realized that really wasn't the case. But I get a chuckle, and I do have sometimes on my resume, I get actor come up. So.
You don't look like a villain. I bet. I mean,
well, in the eyes of the beholder, Steve.
well, Alan, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Your depth of knowledge and your experience is unprecedented, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to have had you join us today and educate us a little bit more about the history of this program, where we're at today, and kind of where we're looking towards the future. And I hope that we have another opportunity to speak with you at some point in the future. I wish you all the best, and I thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure, Steve. Thank you.